The sulphur-crested cockatoo. To look at this bird, we need to define what exactly is a cockatoo. And most people would say it's a large parrot that has a raucous call and a crest. And these are the features that define the family of birds called Cockatooidae. And the origins of the term Cockatooidae are found in the Malay language, meaning a raucous echo. And the bigger the flock, so the more raucous and echoing the calls become. The cockatoo family has several genera: Calyptorhynchus for the black cockatoos and Cockatooidae for the pale cockatoos. And obviously the sulphur-crested is a pale cockatoo, and the pale cockatoos have yellow or pink as their primary colour. The galah and Major Mitchell have a dominance of pink. The corellas may have a little bit of pink or red, but like the sulphur-crested, yellow is the dominant primary colour. In this episode we are looking at the sulphur-crested cockatoo. And the sulphur-crested, like other cockatoos, is a flock-orientated bird. It has a wide distribution throughout Australia with the exception of the central sandy arid desert regions, one of the cityscenes that has adapted well to urbanisation, often being found in parklands of cities. However, the flocks in urban areas are never large, for in urban areas there is a shortage of mature trees with suitable nesting hollows. So in urban areas the sulphur-crested has to compete against birds like the rainbow lorikeet that have even adapted better to urbanisation. And the shortage of nesting holes is one factor that limits the flock size within these urban areas. Cockatoos have a similar diet, so often sulphur-cresteds are found, especially with other pale birds like the galah and the corella, all foraging in the same feeding ground. If we head into western New South Wales we can find huge flocks. I've seen up to 500 birds in one flock. With cockatoos, the larger the bird, so the wing rate slows down, and sulphur-crested cockatoos are at the high end, with the slower wing beat in flight than a galah. The larger birds are the black cockatoos. Sulphur-crested cockatoos can screech. They can also be rather destructive to people growing fruits, and also to the urban gardener. Another outstanding feature with the cockatoos is the bill strength. Just watch as this sulphur-crested dehusks this seed in tropical North Queensland. The most important thing about a cockatoo is the crest, and the sulphur-crested has this beautiful sulphur-coloured crest. The crest is always semi-reclined, but when it rises up into its full cone, it is a beautiful sight. The foraging nature of a sulphur-crested cockatoo is both foliar and terrestrial. In Australia, the typical canopy feeding is in the eucalypts, where it will eat the seed, the flower, and also lick nectar out of the flower. The terrestrial feeding is again directed at seed, both fallen from trees and also grass seed. And perhaps the favourite of many cockatoos are the roots, particularly bulbous roots, and the roots of grass and herbaceous plants. Often you will see sulphur-crested cockatoos chewing on dead wood, and the reason for this is that within this branch there are moth larvae, and the chewing of the moth larvae on the decaying wood within the hollow branch creates a vibration, and as the sulphur-crested cockatoo perches it can feel these vibrations. And so with their strong bills they will dig into the branch looking for the delicacy of the moth larva. But it's not always chasing the larvae. Sometimes they just like to chew, and this is a feature of all cockatoos. The sulphur-crested cockatoo is defined by two colours, yellow and white. Going into the northwest of Australia, the yellow cheek patch disappears and is replaced by plain white, but the lemon yellow tint under the wing persists in both subspecies. Now let's head back into New South Wales to the nominate species and look at some of the terrestrial feeding pattern. The mainstay of foraging for food on the ground for the sulphur-crested is grass and grass seed. They will feed from the grass head, taking the seeds, to the base of the shoot where they get the carbohydrates, to the roots of the grass. Within any flock of birds, there are birds that are dominant, and you can see this here with the sulphur-crested cockatoos. Sometimes a dominant bird will see another cockatoo feeding, and it thinks that what it's eating is a little bit more tasty than what it's found, and will come over and chase that bird off. Let's look again at another example, here in Wagga, and here the birds are eating both dry seed on the ground and digging for roots. Sulphur-crested has dug up a tasty morsel. A dominant bird notices this and, thinking the territory is a little bit better than his own, walks over and displaces this bird, taking over the excavation site where it's been digging for roots. I have no good explanation as to why one bird will become dominant. The sulphur-crested cockatoos are isomorphic, so I cannot tell the difference from a male to a female, but certainly within a group it seems as though there is one dominant bird. As mentioned at this site in Wagga, there was seed on the ground, but it's interesting when you watch cockatoos feed. The greater majority of their feeding is done with a digging process, going in for the root. And there is probably a nutrient value in getting to the roots, for they have more minerals and also fat-soluble vitamins. Just coming back to the dominance of various cockatoos, here a little corella, slightly smaller than a sulphur-crested cockatoo, feeding, but just nearby there are two sulphur-cresteds, and the sulphur-cresteds are foraging for fallen pine nuts. The corella walks over to the site. The sulphur-cresteds immediately give away to the smaller corella, suggesting that the corella is a more aggressive bird, but unfortunately I didn't have a wide-angle shot to show you that there were more corellas at this site than sulphur-cresteds, so the reason for giving away is still a little uncertain. In contrast to this experience, sometimes the sulphur-crested is the more aggressive cockatoo within a mixed flock, and those of you who have watched the galah cockatoo video may remember this clip showing the sulphur-crested at a nesting site chasing away the galah. Here, another example of the sulphur-crested cockatoo with a standoff attitude. Don't come and feed at my site. This sulphur-crested is in a pine tree, and they gather the dried nuts off the ground and eat them. But the shell is hard and extracting the nut difficult. In Australia we have the macadamia nut with a harder shell than a pine nut, and it's only the larger black cockatoo with a larger bill that can crack these. The sulphur-crested is left-footed. In other words, they hold the food in the left claw. Cockatoos, being citizens, are pterodactyl, having 4 toes. As well as holding food, the claw acts as an anvil, stabilising, and the bill has 3 points of impact, the upper mandible just the tip, and the lower mandible a point to either side. Notice how this shell is being held long ways. The lower mandible has most movement, but there is also a little bit of movement in the upper mandible. And the reason for this is that the fusion of the bill to the bony structures of the face is cartilaginous. Some of the parrots have a considerable bigger movement of the upper mandible, so the combined opening of the upper and lower mandible increases the opening of the bill of a cockatoo. See the muscular movements of the tongue? The food is manipulated, and even at the extremities of the bill, enough force can be generated to crack the husk. The tongue is smooth, devoid of any papilla, and traditionally not said to be a honeysucker, but as we have demonstrated, it is certainly a nectar licker, despite having a smooth tongue. Now just a little about bird intelligence. In essence, I believe that a bird's intelligence is measured by its ability to firstly survive, and secondly to reproduce within the environment. We always regard the corvids as being intelligent birds, and the corvids have adapted well to the changing environment of urbanisation. And so have many of the parrots, including the sulphur-crested cockatoo. In nature, the birds adapt from association learning, So if we look at the ability of a bird to flourish within its environment, if the environment changes and the bird adapts to it, do we measure that as a sign of intelligence? Again, I'm a little uncertain with this, because some birds have physiological parameters that prevent them from changing. Underneath, I suspect that a real intelligent bird is the one that's going to not respond to Pavlovian conditioning. And many of you with pet cockatoos will know exactly how dependent a pet bird becomes on the owner, even fretting in the owner's absence. And I'm sure that many of you watching this have very intelligent cockatoos. And those of you that do, I'm sure, are intelligent Pavlovian designers. Now, for those who want to see more about the feeding habits of the sulphur-crested cockatoo, please go back to the earlier video. For now, I'd like to finish off with mating and nesting. All cetaciforms breed in hollows, so parrots, cockatoos, cockatiels, lorikeets are all constantly searching out hollows for a suitable nesting site. In Australia, many of the eucalypts end up with hollow limbs. Some eucalypts have more hollows than others, but in essence, when a eucalypt grows, the lower branches drop off, and where it drops off, this may result in a tree hollow. So the presence of a hollow in a tree tells us the tree is older. Other factors like fire at the base of the tree, limbs breaking off with wind and lightning, in combination with termites, all lead to hollowing of a limb. But in essence, hollows in trees are only in mature trees. And this is why logging of mature trees in forests has a detrimental effect on our wildlife, not only birds but other marsupials that breed in tree hollows. You can see why replanting with young trees isn't always a cure for the wildlife. So it's essential, while logging, that the mature trees of the forest are left. There is a constant debate about birds that are diminishing in number, especially the migratory birds that breed in hollows. The question is whether it's loss of breeding sites like tree hollows or the loss of food, in particular flowering eucalypt. Added to this are other factors: urbanisation, loss of habitat, global warming and feral predation. The interesting thing is, with the availability of nectar, I suspect the European honeybee is far more guilty than what we have believed in the past. It is near impossible to find a flowering eucalypt without European honeybees. For in Australia, the European honeybee is now feral. There are still many apiarists harvesting honey, but in the bush, there are many feral bees from wild hives. The hollow for a cockatoo to breed in has to be larger than what the smaller parrots need. And here you can see this site has been selected by a pair of cockatoos, and they clean up around the edge, go inside, chew on the wood, make some sawdust, and make a nest in which they lay their eggs. All cetaciforms are bonded pairs. The nest is often chosen by the male, and the female is more responsible for cleaning it out and preparing it for nesting. Both birds are said to sit and also feed the chicks when they hatch, regurgitating partially digested seed. When a bonded pair fly to the nest, you will often see them calling to one another with a different pitch. Here they fly and hear the raucous call, but then as they land, each bird raises the crest and call to one another in a perhaps slightly more melodious way. Listen to the echo from the partner bird. Crest raising with sulphur-crested cockatoos is said to be a sign of excitement. And indeed, when the young chicks call from within this hollow log, the birds get excited. With the call of the sulphur-crested cockatoo, when they are in flight, it is far more repetitive. To conclude this video, we will briefly talk about predation. The sulphur-crested cockatoo, being a large bird with a strong, powerful bill, doesn't have a lot of enemies. But the chicks in the nest are preyed on, mostly by reptiles like the python and in particular the goanna. In the previous video we did show you how they chase eagles away from the nesting sites. This concludes our video on the sulphur-crested cockatoo. If you want to get notification of our next release of Australian birds in the wild, hit the subscribe button.